Welcome to the 20th podcast, the Pythagorean Order of Death podcast, or the POD podcast. This is episode number 20. It's going to be the 11th installment of which is an Ask Me Anything that I'm going to be responding to. And it's the first from a new contributor, Austin R., whose last name I'm going to withhold for right now until I have his permission to share it. AR number one. So this is podcast 20, AMA 11, and AR 1 for anybody keeping track. Uh, as always, I'm your host, Jonathan Barlow G. Aloha. Uh, Hello to everyone who's tuning in, and I'm grateful for you all to be here. And whenever you're hearing this, in the future or in the present, just know that you have my gratitude for listening to my drivel for a little while. So let's get to Austin's first question. Out of 15, he posed 15 questions to me. So this should be a nice long, relatively decently long podcast. Let's get to his first question. Uh, what was the inspiration behind the MPDR? The MPDR was a convergence of three separate currents beginning in late 1999 and early 2000. The first was a series of faux news articles, later published as a PDF entitled For New World Order, Some Comedy, that I wrote around then, from which I took a brief essay or two for the history section. The second was the book I wrote in the year 2000 and early 2001 called The Formal System of Metaphysics, or just the FSOM. The third was simply my desire to put forth my own description of metaphysics as completely as I could then. So, in 2003, I had the MPDR published with the FSOM as the first third of the edition, the history section as the second third, and the MPDR proper as the final third of the published work, and so it remains even now. Since then, I've also published each of these sections of that book independently online as PDFs. So there is a FSOM PDF, a history PDF, and the MPDR PDF. I've also produced several videos on YouTube around these works as well. My reason for wanting to present them in that format then was to progress from the purely abstract philosophy of the FSOM through the solidification of the history section into a description of ancient and modern theories about cosmology and ontology. My reason for wanting to present the contents of the MPDR then at all, when it may be argued to have yet been in a larval theoretical form, was that I was concerned about Armageddon, World War III, and the end of days at the time, and figured I should try to leave a record while I could. So the MPDR was my little trace of a contribution to future history, such as it may be. I hope it will prove worth it. How did you form the POD? I get this question a lot, but I never mind repeating the story. By 2007 and '08, I had finished work on my Atlantean calendar designs and was bored and looking for something to do online, so I joined the IlluminatiOrder.com forums. I was a member there until later 2009, early 2010, if I recall correctly, when I left in a huff, published their ritual work as a PDF, and, taking a few other members with me, founded the POD. At first, the POD was just 5 members, each representing one of the 4 elements, and one of us as the 5th element, the group's spirit. I was the water element at first, but when our spirit guide wanted me to swear a death oath to him, I left in a huff and took my earliest POD materials with me. I founded the pod.ning site around then, and its membership flourished for a while, but has long since tapered off and by now that site is virtually dead in terms of traffic, since cell phones have taken over. By 2012, the majority of the material now in the POD Omnibus PDF was worked out in full already, including not just the Egyptian masonry rituals, the Bund lectures, and the Atlantean constitutions, but even the Atlantean Senate board game itself as well. Since then, the Omnibus PDF has been updated more or less annually, and now lives on Google Drive in its most current format, since I can no longer upload to issue.com. At present, the omnibus is 390 pages long, and I have built models at multiple size scales for the buildings it describes. I'm quite pleased with the POD's current form, and future trajectories remain bright for now. How does mathematics work as a second language? As Galileo Galilei put it in The Assayer, 1623, quote, "The laws of nature are written in the language of mathematics. The symbols are triangles, circles, and other geometrical figures, without whose help it is impossible to comprehend a single word, and one who cannot comprehend wanders in vain through a dark labyrinth." End quote. Even dating back to the Academy of Athens, founded by Plato, the student of Socrates and teacher of Aristotle, in 387 BC, the sign above the entrance read, "Let none ignorant of geometry enter here." So, from earliest times, philosophically speaking, math was not considered a second language by sages, but the first language and the mother tongue of all other forms of thought. Indeed, in studying infants, the ability to recognize geometric shapes and patterns develops long before they begin to speak whole words in complete sentences. Most know you can't fit a round peg in a square hole through experience and intuition long before they have the cognitive skills to explain why not by using purely verbal communication. So yes, I would agree with the idea that mathematics is the first language, and that even simply counting our fingers preceded our evolution of guttural speech. Indeed, it would seem to me that numbers were discovered long before writing was first invented. So as for effects such as gematria, as a raw numerical system underlying actual texts, these do occur because the letters, and thus sums, are ultimately finite and therefore bound to repeat and, in good writing, form patterns, etc. But this should not be taken as proof for intelligent design beyond these literary confines. Math can define some texts, but it does define all natural reality. What is your best advice for someone who tries to find irony in wisdom? How can we define wisdom? Let us define it by what it is not. Wisdom is not folly. So what is folly? If folly is lack of self-control, then wisdom is the opposite of this. If folly leads to chaos and disorder, then wisdom is the opposite of this. If folly spreads destruction, suffering, and sorrow, then wisdom is the opposite of this, and so forth. Thus, if wisdom is control and order, then folly is what is out of one's control and of a higher order that may appear to the fool to be mere chaos. So what is this that makes fools of us in the end? Are we all just, as we are all, prey to death? It is karma, basic cause and effect. This is the underlying static noise from which we seek to extract exact rhythmic signal. So, ordinary karma we may call natural and only indirectly and mechanically representative of the will of God. On the other hand, when karma becomes warped in an ironic manner, people often take it as evidence of divine intervention. This is to say, whenever any ironic twist of fate or reversal of fortunes occurs, it is thought to be a sign of the supernatural. So, when ordinary cause and effect divert from the expected outcome, this is often seen as being due to influence by a higher power. Wisdom begins when we recognize these synchronicities and seek to trace them back to their true and actual source, and discover that it is not the universal creator deity who is in charge of such events, but merely our own unconscious, manifesting reality in front of us, from behind our back. There is much irony to be found in wisdom, but, sadly, not much wisdom to be found in irony. What was Mozart's impact on Freemasonry, and has his work influenced music? What I know about Mozart I can almost fit on the head of a pin, but I'll give it a go. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was portrayed by Tom Holtze in the obligatory modern biopic movie about him as an autistic savant who excelled at music from his earliest childhood, but lacked any sense for social graces until the day he died at just age 35. In short, Mozart lived a lifestyle we would easily consider comparable to a modern rock star, but in the late Baroque era of the later 1700s. So it could be argued, and rightly, Mozart's influence wasn't only on Freemasonry, but extended to an almost global culture of the time. His level of fame, and at such a young age, led to deep jealousy in his elder rival Antonio Salieri, which ultimately seems to have led to Salieri literally pressuring Mozart to death by relentlessly pursuing Mozart to craft his ultimate opus, the Requiem Mass for the Dead. In his final year, Mozart also penned the Magic Flute, considered a Masonic-inspired classical opera, although he had originally been initiated into Freemasonry in 1784 when he was only 28 years of age. He composed many works for performance only among Masons and, according to Wikipedia, was a rational, Enlightenment-inspired member, as opposed to those members oriented toward mysticism and the occult, and was even friends with Adam Weishaupt, founder of the Bavarian Illuminati. Beyond this, I cannot tell you much more, because I am neither a musician nor a Freemason myself, and so my learning on such matters is low. Reading is telepathy, yet outside of reading, what are the common places for telepathy? Mind reading is, by definition, telepathy, and, to some extent, the act of reading a book can be considered telepathy between the reader and the author, even if the author is long dead. This applies to some extent to all media, although cinema is particularly mystical in its ability to hypnotize and subliminally suggest ideas to its audience. This is why modern entertainment corporations devote ample funding for theater chains to air them, such are our modern temples and celebrities our pantheon of false gods. Once one realizes one is telepathic, they will usually quickly realize they are telepathic all the time, and that most people's thoughts they can hear are psychotically brutish and profane. At this stage, learning how to not be telepathic again may be appealing, but is ultimately impossible. Telepathy is not only mind reading either. It can also include mind writing, which is essentially hypnotism, and think talking, which is sharing thoughts with another person or people exclusively non-verbally. While mind writing borders on telekinesis for its methods of trying to stimulate the gray matter of a target person's brain itself, other aspects of mentalism go even further, such as clairvoyance, the ability to foresee the future, and manifestation, the ability to create a solid matter object out of thin air using only one's mind alone. As with telepathy, these are not skills one acquires, but aspects of sentient existence we are constantly experiencing and cannot ever turn off, until we are dead at least. So we are always mind reading and always clairvoyant, and we are always manifesting our reality around ourselves, even if we try to forget all this. The most common place for people to experience all these effects in rapid succession is driving in traffic, where having a hypersensitivity level bordering on paranoia can mean the difference between life and death. How do negative and positive sefirot work in the Kabbalah? That depends on the meaning of negative or positive for context in this case, because the tree of life may be ascended upward from Malkuth or descended downward from Kether. There is a form of positive or negative association of the one to the other, even in one's most basic choice for direction in path working. There are also systems, such as the I Ching inspired model proposed by Crowley in the end of his Book of Thoth, that substitute literal plus and minus or yin and yang symbols for the Sephira, Chakma, and Binah in order to accentuate their juxtaposition to one another, alike the pillars of Jachin and Boaz that support them each respectively. However, the most common context for understanding the Sephira in terms of positive and negative attributes, is as the tree of life, the obverse, and the tree of death, the reverse, being light and shadow attributes in this system. In this sense, the sephirot, as emanations, were first contained inside the qliphoth, or shells, until these clay pot vessels broke. It is said that this occurred long ago due to the zimzum, or expansion and contraction of God's breathing, and that the shards of these shattered vessels fell down to become the particles of matter. This event corresponded to the slippage of the middle pillar as well, which caused Malkuth to descend, and the non-Sephiroth Death to open up in the rift of the abyss between the lower seven subtended and the upper three supernal Sephiroth. The study of the Sefirot themselves is considered good and positive white magic theurgy, and so forth, while the study of the qliphoth is considered evil and negative, dark arts demonology, and so forth. What are your thoughts on Agrippa and his impact on the occult? There are a few historical people by the name Agrippa, but the one with the most influence on the modern occult is inarguably Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa von Nettensheim, 1486 to 1535. This Agrippa was a student of the German Benedictine abbot Johann Trithemius, 1462 to 1516, and, in turn, himself a definite influence on British magus John Dee, 1527 to 1609. This Agrippa was the author of the famous Three Books Concerning Occult Philosophy in 1531, of which chapter 22 of Book 2 is devoted to the seven camea, or planetary magic squares. These magic squares are areas tiled by cells in rows and columns, each cell numbered such that each row, column, and both mean diagonals all add to the same magic number sum. So, for example, the magic square of the planet Saturn is a square area of 3 by 3 equals 9 total cells, whose magic sum is 15. The square of the planet Jupiter is of area 4 by 4 equals 16, and its magic number sum is 34, and etc. These forms of what E.A. Wallace Budge, 1857 to 1934, would later categorize as amulets and talismans, have been around since at least the late Chaldean era in 10th dynasty Babylon, from 626 until 539 BC, and among other acrostics or letter squares, such as the Book of Soiga, were intrinsically inspirational for Dee's Enochian system of 4 watchtowers and 91 sigils, etc. Indeed, both the cipher system devised by Trithemius and copious works inspired by Dee are included in the folio manuscripts outlining the rituals in the modern Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Esoteric Mystery Tradition Occult Cult. Where did the flood myth originate? According to Michael Witzel, born 1943, in his 2012 work, The Origins of the World's Mythologies, the core elements of the original myths date to the region we now call Australia, from around 45,000 to around 8 to 6,000 years ago, when the land mass of Southeast Asia, then connecting the Sumatra, Java, and Borneo Islands as a singular peninsula, named by geologists Sunda, was separated from the island continent of Australia, then connecting modern Australia and New Guinea into a larger region called nowadays Sahul, only by the narrow strip of smaller islands called the Wallacean Archipelago. According to Witzel, the basic themes of all subsequent world mythologies can be dated back no further than to the end of the last ice age in this subtropical South Hemisphere region. These recurring motifs include the creation of the world as a world mound, the growth of the first world tree from this mound, the creation of mankind from the mud of this mound, the discovery of angels or trickster-like helper spirits, the breeding of fallen angels with people to sire giants, the destruction of these giants in a world flood, and an ongoing war in heaven between the gods. Notably, Witzel mentions, the myth of a coming Messiah is absent at this stage, although, I would add, not strictly unique to later monotheist cultures either. Since the time period of Sahul and Sunda predates the earliest now known written language, 3500 BC cuneiform, by an additional 2,500 years at the least, it becomes increasingly difficult to trace these mythopoetic memes much further back than this. Was the Kabbalah practiced as a one-world religion? The Kabbalah originally began as strictly Hebrew metaphysics, but metaphysics was once the one-world religion itself. The Kabbalah, as the study especially of what we would now call a fourth-dimensional tesseract or hypercube shape, originated at least by the time of Moses and the exodus of the Hebrew-speaking slaves out of Egypt, if this event ever truly occurred. It's been backdated to around 1310 to 1476 BC. And the seminal text on Kabbalah, the Sefer Yetzirah, purports to date back even further to the patriarch Abraham from a town in modern-day Iraq, once on the now long receded shore of the Persian Gulf, which has been continuously inhabited since the Ubaid period, some 5,500 until 3,700 BC. If we take this approach to dating the origins of a Kabbalah, rather than the more scholastic modern view that archaeology can only unearth evidence for a Kabbalah proper from no sooner than the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, then it becomes readily apparent that it is a metaphysical system ancient in the extreme, but is far from being the oldest such let alone having been accepted worldwide in prehistoric times. Personally, I believe the earliest idea of any metaphysical nature led to or was inspired by the invention of the cat's cradle looped string game, played for recreation by interweaving a single loop of string by passing it around and between one's fingers. This game seems to date back to the same region of Sahul and Sunda in modern Australia, some 10,000 years ago at least, and corresponds, according to Witzel, with the origins of the earliest myths there. Because of the primitive status of these foundational ingredients of civilization at that time, the earliest worldwide religion may have consisted of little more than this string game, the oldest elements of oral myths, and the earliest ambitions toward the globally expanding Kurgan culture of the late Neolithic era, 10,000 until 3000 BC, not to mention the first use of cowrie shell money. Are magic rituals used for luck, such as someone keeping a horseshoe because it's good luck? Superstitious magic has always been applied to what modern sub-geniuses call the luck plane. The belief is that, by some means or other, an individual can alter the orientation of this luck plane, which the ancients associated with the underworld, which Jung called an acausal connecting principle, active in the collective unconscious, and which Terence McKenna called an invisible landscape of novelty, speeding up as it counts down along time wave zero, and thus bring good fortune to themselves and their chosen causes. The idea of gods was invented, likely on drugs, as a means for imagining environmental elements as like people who can be communicated with more or less directly. The oldest now known codified religions or occult practices involve a shaman or medicine man taking a hallucinatory entheogen and going before the gods on behalf of their petitioner or their patient who is considered spiritually sick. These priests or psychopomps would enter a deep trance condition and utter prophecies. So, oracles of this nature and other more practical wizards or makers of amulets and talismans were pivotal in the oldest now known religions. The belief in curses like the evil eye was common, and wearing magic number-sum squares carved into certain metals was said to protect against this. On the street level of base superstition, this was the common norm. In the upper echelons of the earliest aristocratic monarchies of Sumer and Akkad, circa 5500 until 3300 BC, priests performed complex ceremonial sacrifices to appease the nature gods and seek favor for the rulers and their nations. Of course, these sacrifices were only demanded in order to feed the priest class themselves, and not one of their magical ceremonies has ever influenced any outcome in reality by one iota. Still, religion remains practiced to this day, and a god, in some form, is believed in by an estimated 97% of the 8+ billion human population. Where does the Jesus myth come into place in history? The prophetic myths of a coming world savior preceded the supposed lifetime of Jesus, such that, when he preached, he often insinuated that this world savior was himself. For example, when he was quizzed about his status by Pontius Pilate, who asked him point blank, "Are you the king of the Jews?" by which many scholars presume Pilate meant the world savior prophesied by the Jews, Jesus is said to have replied, "That is what they call me." This hyperbolic logic fits in well with the character of Jesus given in the New Testament Gospels, where Jesus is portrayed as a minister of public parables who only disclosed deeper meanings to his groomed apostles. It was these books about him, but not directly written by Jesus himself, that have come to codify the so-called Jesus myth that describes how the world Savior was born, lived, and died 2,000 years ago. Of course, the Jesus myth that was born of these Gospels was written from the point of view of those around Jesus, rather than ever being from the perspective of Jesus himself, indicating their nature as having been forged later than the events being described, and often by people who weren't actually there themselves. The way I would categorize it, this Jesus myth can be broken up into three essential phases. One, the birth myth, which posits a person named Jesus even existed at all. Two, the myth of the vagrant philosopher, sometimes extended to the Orthodox belief in an ascended man. And three, the death myth, establishing Jesus' divinity as the Son of God. Now, if the first phase of this myth doesn't hold, then the rest is mere fiction. So most Christians simply suspend their disbelief and accept with little contextual evidence that Christ existed. The rest remain agnostic as to his existence, hoping for a writing of his own to someday surface to substantiate the otherwise only faith-based claims. Then, if we look at the second phase of the Jesus myth, involving his ministry and teachings, we find that many of his morals had been taught before for ages. The Golden Rule was never his own invention, but paraphrased from the Asclepian literature of the Corpus Hermeticum. Just as the 42 negative declarations before Ma'at in Egypt preceded the moral code of Moses' Ten Commandments, so too did the Greek Hippocratic Oath, "Harm none," precede Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Lastly, we come to the issue of Jesus' miracles and his divinity overall, which matter is best described by the final phase of the Jesus myth, the story of his death, resurrection, and reappearances. Assuming all the miracles to be confabulations, the moral lessons of Jesus' teachings remain as firm as those of Buddha, who had lived some 600 to 500 years before. If Buddha had not attained nirvana beneath the Bodhi tree, his moral teachings would still be wise. And likewise, if the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus were mere narrative embellishments, the ethical teachings of Jesus would still remain philosophically useful to living a moral life. Taking away the divinity of Jesus does not topple the religion of Christianity, only solidifies it in a more rational foundation. So this in total is the Jesus myth that began around the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, and of which Pope Leo X, 1475 to 1521 AD, was once alleged to have said, quote, "It has served us well, this myth of Christ." End quote. It is my theory that, behind the character of Jesus as the world Savior presented in the Gospels, was the reality of Yeshua ben Padia, the Qumran exile who practiced Coptic Egyptian and Gnostic Hebrew magic, and that, behind the Jesus myth, is the reality of the Angel Scroll, the only text now known, purportedly written by Yeshu himself. Are most esoteric clubs self-improvement? At this point, yes, almost all occult orders, secret societies, and esoteric clubs promote themselves as self-help to prospective new members. The level of discipline one applies to learning, internalizing, and adhering to the cult's values varies from person to person, and the amount of learning and dedication these groups require varies as well. Some have thick holy books and many degrees of initiation, while others have short books and few degrees. So anyone can go through, say, the 10 degrees of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn and learn nothing at all, while some will come through this ordeal spiritually transformed and properly prepared to function as an initiate of that group. Likewise, the same two people may be exposed to the rank and file of the Rites of Memphis and Mizraim and its 99-degree hierarchy, and then the person unmoved by the HOGD may be ennobled by the ROMM. As each individual's goals are unique, so one may benefit from one group, but not another. So, in the end, all may offer the same end goal, self-help for the individual, but not all such groups are set up the same way to benefit every individual exactly equally. In short, buyer beware. Are aliens future time travelers? Maybe. On the grounds that to travel 1,000 light years at light speed to Earth from some faraway star system would take the same amount of time, 1,000 years, as a round trip from just 500 years in the future. It is therefore arguable that most extraterrestrial activities on Earth are more likely time travelers from our own future. The premise of ancient aliens being time travelers from our future resolves the Fermi paradox on these matters adequately, but proposes the dangerous idea that human history in its entirety is caught in a repeating time loop. Future aliens created past humans who evolve into future aliens. This is an infinite feedback loop in time, and so implies humanity itself may be a temporal jinn or self-causing event or phenomenon. Given the potential for terrestrial influencing, closed time-like curves, CTCs, future humans may be the gods who created past humans. Whether true or not, it certainly constitutes a novel idea, worthy of wasting any amount of time exploring. Have you ever heard of Tartaria? If so, did it happen, or is it debunked? The resurgence of the term Tartaria appears to be a modern urban legend and conspiracy theory based on ancient, incomplete maps that labeled unknown or unexplored regions of northeastern Europe and western Russia, notably the northern Caucasus mountain range, Tartaria. The term Tartar was never a real word referring to a real place, culture, or people. It was originally a term meant as a slur for the unknown, in the same way the term barbarian entered the lexicon as a slur, barbar, for how non-Greek speaking people sounded to the Greeks. The Aryan race supremacists of the Third Reich revived the concept of Tartaria in modernity as a means of fabricating a false history for their adversaries, the Jews. Thus, Tartaria, along with Hollow Earth, entered the modern gossip columns as a global conspiracy of cartographers. The late 20th century revitalization of the flat Earth was not far behind, and even, so far as I am currently aware, preceded the Tartarian myth's description of a mud flood. Insofar as conspiracy theories and urban legends constitute the high and low forms of modern superstitious mythology, respectively, they deserve to be studied rather than suppressed. But to the extent they are fictional, they have no positive use value in reality. And so that concludes Austin's 15 questions. And the 20th episode of the Pythagorean Order of Death podcast. I hope that you all enjoyed it. I hope that you had fun hearing me answer questions, and I hope that you enjoyed the questions that were asked. If any of you have any questions that you would like to have asked and answered on this podcast, please feel free to contact me at my email address, which is BENPADIAH at gmail.com. That's benpadia at gmail.com. And if you'd like to submit questions on any subject matter, I specialize in metaphysical contemplations, as I'm sure anyone who's tuned in long enough by now knows. I love symbology and deconstructing it to find its inherent meanings and relative correspondences to others' meanings in symbolical frameworks as well. So I guess I'll call this episode a wrap for now, and just say once again, as always, thanks to everyone for tuning in, and I hope you all have a wonderful time in reading and writing and in listening and in viewing my content, and that you'll all continue doing so into the future. Thanks again. I'm Jonathan Barlow G, and signing off. Peace.